Well, a few weeks ago in biblical literature, we came to the conclusion that the KJV would be our Bible from here on out, and we gave you the reasons for that, and I think that would be the best and a wise decision, although you certainly can make use of some of the other newer translations. Prior to looking at the KJV, it seemed like we were just hitting one version after another in the period of the 1500s, one translation after another. Whenever we come to the KJV, we are going to have what we might call somewhat of a silent period for the next 250 years. You ask, well, was the KJV ever formally revised? Yes, it was, 250 years after it was written. And see, that's not been true of all these other translations, because the KJV is a revision of a Bible. That was a revision of a Bible. That was a revision of a Bible. And so the next question is, was the KJV ever revised? Yes, it was. In the end of the 1800s, over 250 years after it was written. And here's what's interesting. We've seen up until this time, every time a revision of a revision comes along, then that final revision is what stands for a shorter or longer period of time. Well, this Bible that was done by Westcott and Hort under their leadership in the late 1800s, which was the first formal revision of the KJV, was used for a couple of years and then passed off the scene. For the first time, the revision doesn't take over that which it revised. No one uses, and they haven't for almost 100 years. No, probably for 100 years, literally speaking. For 100 years, this revision of the KJV has not been used. The KJV held its ground after that. So I will use Jack Lewis's statement again from Harding School of Religion in Memphis. Don't sign the KJV's death certificate too quickly. People have always, over the years, pronounced its death. Well, finally we have a formal revision in the 1880s, let's say, and so that'll be the end of the KJV. Not so, not so. That Bible died within a couple of years, and the KJV was still there. And then another revision in 1901, and that Bible died. And then all the other Bibles that have come along, some of them haven't died yet. We'll have to give them time to see whether or not they die. There's just something about the KJV that has made it lasting and enduring. It's certainly the monumental piece of English literature. It surpasses Shakespeare. It surpasses all English writings and literature since then, because all English writings and literature quote from the Bible, quote from the KJV, which shows its supremacy and its ascendancy over them. But not all is peaches and cream for the KJV and its legacy. It held its ground with hardly any resistance after that first 50-year period when it finally took over the Geneva Bible. It held its ground with just a little bit of resistance for quite some time. But a small amount of resistance did begin to grow during the 18th and especially the 19th centuries, and that resistance culminated in the revised version of the Bible in the 1880s. Why do we go over such a long period of time? We don't have any changes. The KJV essentially remains as the number one Bible. Or to ask the question another way, what was it that caused, after 250 years, and really it wasn't that long because the resistance started and began to grow and culminates at the end of the 19th century, what was it that caused this resistance and that caused it to grow so rapidly in the 19th century? Well, that's what we're going to begin looking at this morning, some of the factors of the revision of the KJV, and it will take us a few weeks before we get to that actual revision. The KJV was so superior, it was innately so superior that it overcame the Bishop's Bible within less than 50 years. It overcame the Puritans' Geneva's Bible, and nothing rose in those Bibles' places to challenge the supremacy of the KJV for, as I say, hundreds of years. Now, there were various little small translations, let's say between 1611 and 1881 and 82. There were various small translations, perhaps as many as 70 or 80 of them. We're going to mention and cover some of those, certainly not all of them, and we'll be doing this over the next few weeks. But those didn't play the role that the KJV has played, or that its formal revision did in the 1880s. But what was it? I mean, we must have some causes. Something is changing. The 1800s started in the 1700s and culminates in the late 1800s. Something is changing. English people are thinking or seeing things differently, and all of a sudden we had this thought the KJV needs to be revised. No one had even attempted up until that time. So here are some of the factors that contribute to the need of a revision of the KJV, or at least the need in people's minds. First of all, we have already demonstrated this before in looking at the King James Version, mistranslations were noted. Mistranslations were noted. In the second place, various irregularities were spotted, inconsistencies in the translation of a word from book to book or passage to passage. In the third place, a change in the language was inevitable. Languages, including our own, including during our own day and age, do not remain static. They will always change. And our language is in the process of change now. No language ever becomes final and fixed. That's impossible. Because, well, just by virtue of the fact, let's say, of technological scientific advancement, whenever new things are invented, you're going to have to find a word for them. They wouldn't need a word back 300 years ago for a lot of the things that we use every day now because the things hadn't been invented. But not only would that be a cause, just the nature of the change of the people. The change of the era is going to necessitate the change of the language. Its literary style, the spelling of terms, that's changing. It's currently changing in the English tongue right now. The diction and so forth. Then in the fourth place, and here's where we're going to camp out this morning, vast and ever-increasing advancements in the whole realm of biblical scholarship are on the horizon and actually coming into view. I mean, the mistranslations one could deal with. You could just correct them. Irregularities, you could perhaps smooth those out. A change in the language, well, you could update it. And publishers have done that over the last few hundreds of years. They've updated the language and the spelling of the KJV. All those things are relatively small and they can be dealt with. I mean, our language hasn't changed so drastically, let's say, between 1900 and 1980 that we just need to start all over again. The changes have occurred. The same is true between 1611 and 1711. We can easily understand the KJV as we read it today, your 1611 edition, particularly if someone would just update the spelling for you. Then you use essentially all those words. There are a few that you don't use and a lot of new ones that you have. But if someone would update the spelling for you, you found it a little difficult with the V's and U's and all of this, you could read it. It's English. It's not Old English. It's modern English. It's not even Middle English. It's modern English for us. It's the same words and everything. Yes, the spelling is a little bit different. But with this fourth point, these vast changes and advancements, and they weren't a regression but a progression in biblical scholarship, particularly but not limited to the languages and the text of Scripture, then we're going to have the need of a change. There's a much greater insight and skill, I think, possessed in the Hebrew and Greek tongues. This began with the fall of Constantinople in the mid-15th century A.D., which we discussed before. The scholars of Constantinople were the Greek scholars. They were the ones who had all the manuscripts. When Constantinople fell in 1453, overrun by the Turks and the Ottoman Empire. And what did all these scholars do? These Eastern scholars, they all flocked, they all migrated to the west over to Rome, which had been the capital of that part of the empire, and Constantinople of the east, ever since the 1930s, Istanbul. And when they came, they brought better manuscripts, they brought much greater insight into biblical scholarship, into textual questions, into, well, as we're studying right now, the Hebrew and Greek tongues. They were much better scholars than that. Now in the West, of course, they had known Latin, and they were proficient in Latin. They had known it for all these centuries. But as we've seen earlier, the revisions of the revisions of the revisions of the Vulgate have corrupted the text of the Vulgate extremely by this time. And the old Latin translation is so corrupt by this time because there are so many recensions and families of texts. So we need help, we need insight, and the scholars of Constantinople do indeed bring that. The grammar and the idiom of these languages was studied in Rome, in the West, and appreciated like never before. Comparative linguistics, which was just on the rise at this time, helped to solve problems related to obscure passages and infrequently used words, particularly those found in the Old Testament. What we mean by comparative linguistics is this: for the first time in the West, we have scholars who are interested in, for example, the Arabic tongue. Well, there are a lot of similarities between Arabic and Aramaic. So if we've got Western scholars, maybe English scholars, who are also proficient in Arabic, we've got some rare Aramaic or Hebrew, an Oriental language and tongue. We've got some rare word in the Old Testament. You can't find any way to determine what this word means. Maybe it has a cognate in some other Near Eastern language. And before that time, no one was interested, not scholars in the West, interested in studying old tongues from ancient Egypt and what today is Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq, the whole Levant, the Middle Eastern world. People weren't interested in studying that in the West. But if we've got a rare term, and see, this is done today, comparative linguistics were just on the rise at this time. And now it's a full-blown textual scientific study today. That if you can look into another language, think how many of our words come from Latin and come from Greek. And if you could study in those languages, Latin and Greek, maybe then you could transfer yourself over into English and come out with the idea, the meaning of some English term that you didn't know otherwise. People who know or have ever studied Latin and Greek have found that to be helpful when they've come across English words they didn't know the meaning to. But they can tell by looking at the word, well, I know what this came from. This came from such and such in Greek and Latin. And they know what the Greek or the Latin said. Well, it's easy to tell what the English said. Think how that could be used, let's say, between Arabic and Hebrew, or between Arabic and Aramaic. So comparative linguistics is on the rise here. We're talking about the whole realm of biblical scholarship is vastly improved. Not as much today as it was then, or not as much then as it is today, but tremendously improved over what it had been just prior to this. I think that much light was shed on the Old Testament from another quarter of biblical scholarship, and that was archaeology. The period of the Crusades, let's just date from 1000 to 1200 AD, just to kind of be general. The period of the Crusades, the travels of Marco Polo, the 13th century AD. And some other things like this. The spice trade established after that between the West and countries like India gave people the travel bug they'd never had before. I mean, traveling in ancient times was like taking your life in your own hands. Traveling with the methods of transportation they had then, and you're trying to go from Western Europe to the Orient, to India, to China, was unheard of. But the travels of Marco Polo and the publication of his memoirs opened up this whole area, and so did the Crusades, where thousands upon thousands of people, including children, in one of the Crusades in particular, made the perilous journey from, let's say, Spain and France and Italy all the way down to Palestine. And what does that do once you ever hit the land of Palestine? I've been over there, and it does it for anyone that goes there. You get bitten by the bug. You think, I've been reading about these stories from a faraway country. Now I'm here. Why don't we investigate some of these cities and see if there's any way we can prove that such and such was true in the Old Testament or such and such was true in the New on the basis of archaeology. So this is exactly what's going on during this time. People are actually making the trip to Palestine for purposes of archaeological discovery and investigation. And in doing that, light is shed on the Old Testament. Not just in looking at old cities and where old battles were fought, but you can find old writing materials like the ostraca, the potsherds, the old parchment, some of which was found during this time. But here in our fourth point, nothing helped in this area as much as the discovery and or availability of a scholarly study of the ancient manuscripts. This is the final thing that pulls the plug out of the dam that's holding the river back. This is what opens people's eyes up in the final sense to the fact we've got to do something about the KJV. Archaeology and comparative linguistics were one thing, but nothing helped as much in this area, in the area of going somewhere further with the KJV, as the discovery and the availability and the scholarly study of the ancient manuscripts. Here's what took place, if you've wondered how this actually happened or how your earlier studies of textual criticism would fit in with what we're looking at now. It gradually came to be recognized that the KJV's chief problem was not in a couple of mistranslations, it was not in inconsistencies, it was not in antiquated language or archaic spelling. What was the KJV's chief problem? An inferior manuscript, inferior textual tradition behind it. And how would you know that? Until you had the discovery and or the availability of some of these manuscripts never seen before, never perhaps known before, but that go back much further, much earlier in history than the manuscripts upon which the KJV's text had been based. So they saw the chief problem was the KJV's underlying text. It was based on, as you well know by this time, late Byzantine manuscripts of inferior quality. And you see, Byzantium, as you know, is just the old name and the first name for Constantinople. And we've just praised Constantinople for the great scholarship that was there that fled to the west. But again, you've got to remember this. Yes, great scholarship, but manuscripts there were far removed from Palestine. Manuscripts there were not of the same textual tradition or family or type as those that were much closer to Palestine, such as those down in what is today Saudi Arabia and down in Egypt. This late underlying text of the KJV came to be known as the received text, or the Textus Receptus, from the 1633 edition of the Elzevir brothers' printed Greek text. And this distorted the true ancient text, particularly in the New Testament. This is on Lit Tape 42, if you want to compare that. Have you noticed whenever we've discussed textual criticism in the past, most of it has been directed at the New Testament. We go to all these New Testament passages and not the Old. Well, that's because so many of the manuscripts contained only the New Testament. They were only concerned with the Greek. When we talk about Byzantine manuscripts and the inferior textual tradition behind the KJV, you have to remember that at least 90% or maybe even higher of the time, the emphasis is New Testament, not Old. The Old and its reliability has to go back to things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, as well as some of the rabbinical works and writings. So primarily we're talking about the New Testament and its text. You probably will recall that's where you've done most of your changing in the KJV, is in the New Testament and not the Old. And there's a reason for that. It's because the Greek texts were of the New Testament and not the Old. So let's just review here for a few moments this morning some of these manuscripts that are coming to light either in discovery or availability. They've been closed up prior to this, right around this time, let's say between 1611 and 1880. This is the period we're talking about, where, what's going on? Well, a lot's going on, basically because of the increase in biblical scholarship, and that is true basically because of the availability and the study of the ancient manuscripts. So in the first place, the manuscript Alexandrinus. The manuscript Alexandrinus. And since we have discussed all of these in much detail, I'll give you a cross-reference for them. This would be Lit Tape 54. Lit Tape 54, where we deal in detail with this manuscript Alexandrinus. But now you'll appreciate, I think, some of the information you learned then a little more, and it'll fit better in the scheme of things in your mind. So here's a brief review of that. A man by the name of Cyril Lucar, L-U-C-A-R, who was a patriarch at Constantinople, had in his possession this 5th century manuscript from Egypt, hence its name Alexandrinus, from Alexandria, Egypt, which puts us, as you see, much closer to the biblical lands. He had in his possession this 5th century manuscript from Egypt. And he arranged for it to be taken to King James of England, as a gift from the Holy See of Constantinople through the British ambassador to Constantinople, Sir Thomas Roe, R-O-E. And this was to take place in 1625. As you can learn on that tape or from your notes, its arrival was delayed. It didn't reach England until 2 years later, 1627. By then, King James is dead, Charles is on the throne, and as you can see from the chronology, the KJV has just recently been completed. They didn't, in other words, they missed by not even 2 decades the use of this very important manuscript, Alexandrinus. It was known, it was over in Constantinople, but the West didn't have access to it. The Holy See in Constantinople had possession of it. Whenever it finally made it to England, it wasn't really given to Charles. James is dead now. It was actually sent to a man by the name of George Abbott. Do you remember him? He was one of the translators. At this time, he is Archbishop of Canterbury. And it has arrived 16 years too late. One of those ironies of history, we might say. That would have changed a lot of the text of the KJV, because Alexandrinus is not a Byzantine manuscript, it's an Alexandrian manuscript. It has an Alexandrian text type behind it. Think how that would have changed what the KJV had to say if the men would have been willing to do a little more investigation and be willing, and this would be a hard thing to do, but let one manuscript, as well as maybe a few others and a few church fathers' quotations, one manuscript stand as the dominant one and put under the rug or on the shelf hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of others. See, that's the argument of people. That's the argument of some today. Well, there's no way that you can discard hundreds of manuscripts in favor of a couple of manuscripts from Egypt or from Sinai. Doesn't make sense. Well, only if you think with the number mentality does it not make sense. What if those hundreds and hundreds are late and inferior? Well, they'd be worth burning then, if you've got a few good ones that are early ones that are more reliable. So what do? What does Abbott do? Well, they look at the manuscript and they compare it with the Greek text type behind the KJV, and they see immediately that there is a vast difference. It's like 2 different Bibles here in many different places. And what conclusion do they arrive at? They arrive at the conclusion that Alexandrinus seems to be the better of the 2. But what can you do now? I mean, James himself has sponsored this Bible, the first great Bible, and think of the beauty of the language and the literature of the KJV. What are you going to do now in 30? Start a new translation process and choose new members and a new committee all over again, and then try to convince all these scholars and convince the world and convince the monarchy in England and convince Parliament that, well, we were wrong. It'd be like the Catholics said, every time you revise something, you just prove that you were wrong the first time, and who's to say but you're wrong this time? And it proved the Catholics were right. 20 years after the KJV, they come and say, you know, guys, we made a mistake. All those hundreds of manuscripts that we had are no good. They're all Byzantine, late text type, they're no good. Well, they didn't see all of that then. Of course, that's going to take many years after this before you can put all the pieces of this textual puzzle together. But they know something's on the up and up here. Something's not the way that it should be. The KJV is, well, shall we say, inferior to the text type behind Alexandrinus. So what do we do? Well, they were honest enough, at least Abbott was, to recognize it, but it's too late to do anything about it. They had worked under the unavoidable disadvantage of poor manuscripts. It was unavoidable to them. What could they do? They didn't have any choice. They didn't have available the manuscripts that came to light later. And we're saying the discovery or the availability of these manuscripts is what gave rise to the science of textual criticism. You didn't have anything to compare or contrast. It was just Byzantine, Byzantine, Byzantine everywhere. It gave rise to the science of textual criticism, which then gave rise to almost innumerable 19th and 20th century translations. And that's why we have so many. And there's a good argument behind it. Now we have better manuscripts, a better text time. So we should be able to produce a better translation. Should is a big word, though. You should be able to, but then better is a word that, well, it can mean one thing in one case and something else in another. Beat the writing of the KJV, in my opinion, that would be impossible. Improve a few verses, surely, but you could also do that on your own in the KJV. So there's one manuscript, Alexandrinus, Lit Tape 54. Number 2, the Codex Ephraemi, E-P-H-R-A-E-M-I. The Codex Ephraemi, Lit Tape 55. Now we're about on, 200 or something numberings in Lit, so that shows you how long ago that was. But that fits in right with what we're studying now. Here's another 5th century manuscript. But sometime prior to AD 1200, the text of the New Testament was erased, and the writings and commentaries of the Syrian church father Ephraim, hence the name Ephraemi, Ephraim, which for him was spelled E-P-H-R-A-E-M, not like Ephraim of the Old Testament. The commentaries and writings of Ephraim were written in. So what we have here is known as, you probably remember technically, as a palimpsest. A palimpsest. A palimpsest was an ancient manuscript that had been scraped or erased, really it was scraped, and a new text had been written in over it. But as we know today, when you try to erase something, there's almost visibly or invisibly the remains of it still there. And so what you got is a writing on top of a writing. So what you need to do is somehow get behind the bolder, the more recent, the newer writing. If you try to erase it, then you can't even see it, and you'll probably erase even more of what was behind it. But you got to get to the text that's behind the text, or the writing behind the writing. And this is what they've tried to do. Now, it was at Paris. But at the time the King James translation was made, did they know about Ephraemi? Well, they knew about it. But they didn't know it was a palimpsest. That wasn't discovered until, the period between 1611 and 1880. What do they think Ephraemi was? It was a collection of the writings of the Syrian father Ephraim. They had no idea it was a palimpsest, and that there was a 5th century, he lived back in the 5th century too, Ephraim. There was a 5th century New Testament text underneath, behind, almost invisible there. You could see something there, but almost invisible there behind the commentary writings of Ephraim. What if they had known about it at the time? Well, it's doubtful, even if they had known about it, that they would have had the scientific equipment to be able to lift off of the page what was hidden behind the more recent writings of the church father Ephraim. You see, they use advanced, today like Charlesworth, James Charlesworth, the Syriac scholar. They use advanced space-age technology and space-age photography to get behind the text that's on top and try to read what's underneath. And they're successful, like 99% of the time. You can read what's behind it with the space-age technology that they have today. In earlier years, you had to rub chemicals on it that would try to lift out the old ink that was made out of plants and vitriol and gall and so forth. They would try to lift out and bring that out, but in the process of rubbing these chemicals on, you stood the likelihood of destroying the manuscript, or of obliterating the underlying text, or of obliterating the text of Ephraim. Now, the text of Ephraim would not be as important as the text of Scripture itself, but for church history reasons, church fathers reasons, it'd be good to know what Ephraim had to write as well. So here's another disadvantage of the KJV writers. They knew that this manuscript was available and it was at Paris, but it wasn't biblical. It was the writings of Ephraim. And it wasn't until the mid-1800s that Tischendorf, a name famous in textual criticism, that Tischendorf discovered that Ephraim was really not Ephraim, it was the New Testament, and that he was able to fairly successfully decipher it. That's not until 1850. Notice then the proximity of the Revised Version, 1880. These things are just bursting upon the scene in the mid to late 19th century. Then in the third place, another point of new beginnings for Bible translation is the manuscript Vaticanus, Lit Tape 54. Vaticanus. This manuscript was known to have existed as early as 1475. That's the earliest. Read it. I don't know why, but the guys were superstitious, and they certainly weren't allowing Protestant scholars or Western scholars to even have a peep at it. So Vaticanus was known to have existed as early as 1475. So the scholars who did the work on the KJV knew that Vaticanus existed, but you had no way of getting it. It was closely guarded by the popes and locked up in the library in Vatican City. But then finally, in the mid-1800s, around 1850 again, Tischendorf, same man Tischendorf, Count Tischendorf, the German scholar. Tischendorf was allowed to see it. And after him, Tregelles, another name you'll remember from our textual criticism studies. Tregelles, Samuel Tregelles. They were both allowed to see it in the mid-1800s. It's a huge manuscript, an extremely important one. Unlike Alexandrinus and Ephraimite, it wasn't a 5th century, but a 4th century manuscript. And what did Tischendorf, and more than him, Tregelles, what did Tregelles do when he was allowed to see this manuscript? He committed huge portions of it to memory. They let him in at certain hours of the day to review the manuscript, but no pencils or paper or anything in there to write, and of course no cameras then. And so what did he do? Well, with his huge intellect, he was able to memorize vast portions. Memorize it just long enough so that at the end of the day, when they put you out and locked it back up, you hurried back to your home or your apartment and started writing out everything that you could remember. And of course, he had to write it all out in Greek because he wanted to remember exactly what the Greek had to say there, and where this letter was, and where it was divided, and everything. And then you go back the next day and you memorize another page or two. How would you like that burden, that responsibility to be on your shoulders? He felt it was very important for, Christianity and for the whole world to know what did this manuscript Vaticanus have to say. And the stingy popes in Rome wouldn't allow anyone to visit and to see except these men. And I guess they didn't give them an IQ test before they came. They would have known anyway that Tischendorf and Tregelles had huge intellects, but I doubt they would have thought that these guys are so serious. Catholics weren't serious about Bible translation, remember. But these guys are so serious, they're going to memorize. Day after day going into memorizing huge portions, writing it at home that night so you could scratch your memory and start over fresh the next day. Western scholars were finally not allowed full access to Vaticanus until the early 1900s. That is this century. This century. And now the text of Vaticanus has been photo reproduced, and facsimiles of it are available anywhere and everywhere. Everyone can read the text of Vaticanus now. That is, it's available. But we weren't allowed to see it on a large scale until the early 1900s. You see, Tregelles and Tischendorf couldn't memorize all of it. They had large portions of it memorized, but not all of it. So whenever Vaticanus finally is available, don't you think that's going to be a new impetus for more English translations in the 1900s? And it's exactly what it's done. As soon as you get new manuscripts, people want to go back to the drawing board and go back and reinvent the wheel, start all over again and give us a new, fresh translation. And as we read from a scholar last week or 2 weeks ago, and I agree, it's a little comical by the 1980s, we don't need any new English translations. We can discover a whole cake of books and ancient parchment scrolls somewhere in Palestine or Egypt. And it'd be interesting and exciting, and as he was arguing, that's often where it ends right there, is we just get so wrapped up in comparing and contrasting that we don't live the word that we're studying all the time. Amen. Think of someone like Tregelles or Tischendorf. I mean, they certainly weren't biblical Christians as we are and as we believe you should be, but think of how well they knew manuscripts and the Greek text and everything, and they were studying about and memorizing all about the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5. Did they go home and live it that afternoon then? Probably not. For them, it was just a vocation. You know, I'm a textual scholar. What my calling is, my 8 to 5 job is memorize biblical texts and go back home and write them. But does it change your life? Well, as a scholar has said, away with all these translations and comparing and contrasting and bickering. Just pick out one that you like. They're all basically equal and start living it. People would do the same thing today, I think, if a new cake of manuscripts were uncovered. Then in the fourth place, we've got the manuscript Sinaiticus, also lit tape 54. And you'll remember the history of this manuscript. The others were known to exist. This manuscript was not even discovered until the mid to late 1800s by the man Count Tischendorf. Not even discovered until then. It also, as Vaticanus Sinaiticus, was a 4th century manuscript. Now you have a few oddballs. Maybe I need to mention this today. You have a few oddballs in this post-textual criticism age, like William Pickering, like Zane Hodges, professor of Greek at Dallas Theological Seminary, who would still swear with their eye teeth over Byzantine text types. I mean, even trained scholars, they think this whole business of Alexandrian text types, Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, is a hoax. They think the whole thing is some type of hoax, that there's no way that we should surrender all these thousands of manuscripts, number question again, for the relatively few, however, very, very early 5th and 4th centuries AD, and base our English text upon that. So you might want to take note of that. We've got a few around. Zane Hodges is probably the best known name because he is a scholar. Zane, Z-A-N-E, Zane Hodges. He's a professor at Dallas Seminary. I don't know how they let him in down there. He is an oddball, a scholarly oddball, because other scholars don't hold to that. Now you know that lay people react very vehemently against it and try to, quote, open your eyes about it, that they took out the blood and Westcott and Hort took out the deity of Christ and the atonement, and that's all a lot of nonsense. It's all a lot of nonsense. So people have to do study. Why, how Zane ever ends up here is kind of a mystery to me, but I think he bases everything on the number question. His argument is there's just no way. I mean, people in their right mind don't throw out hundreds of examples of what we should be following and then choose to follow one or two when they disagree with these hundreds. But we've got to remember the hundreds are late. They're late, they're late. They're not early. And the few that we have, like Alexandrinus and Ephraim, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, are very, very early. They're few. We don't have very many on their side. They're few in number, but they're very early. So with the combination of the discovery and or availability of all of these manuscripts, basically during the 1800s, the 19th century, maybe now you can see why it was so many hundreds of years before the KJV was revised. It was the best. Nothing could outdo it until new manuscripts came along. And what was immediately seen, and it was a revelation to a lot of people, a lot of scholars included, was that the KJV was based on an inferior underlying text. I mean, people like Westcott and Hort didn't start out, or even the other scholars didn't start out being blasphemous against the KJV, as some would have us believe. But your study leads you in that area. Your study leads you to that conclusion. Here is the evidence. Here are the facts. Then you have to make some concluding decision on the basis of them. And their decision was that we need to do something about the KJV because it was based on such an inferior underlying text. As far as its own translation, it's beautiful and it couldn't be beaten. And even the translators of the EV or the RV said that. And I read a quote from them earlier. They even said that you can't beat the KJV as far as its translation is concerned, but we can the text. So with all this in mind, it becomes more important as we move through the 1700s and enter into the 1800s. Why don't we, with the short time we have left this morning, start looking at some of these early works, some of the earliest works that were produced. They were produced not on the basis of new textual understanding, because we're going to start back in the 1600s, as a matter of fact, for the couple that came then, but probably based more on personal motives. And if I might use a metaphor to paint the scenery from, let's say, the 1600s up until the 1800s, then the metaphor would be the National Military Cemetery in this country, Arlington, where you have row after row after row after row of tombstones of dead soldiers, most of them all but long forgotten. And that's a good metaphor and a good picture of what the scenery of Bible translation looks like from the 1600s up into 1800s. Tombstones with men's names and their translation on them that prove nothing more but these men are long since dead and forgotten. Tombstone after tombstone after tombstone. In other words, none of them rising out of the ground and being something living or something important. We can never put a tombstone over the KJV. I mean, it's a living, vital force today. But all of these other translations that came between it and the EV or the RV are like tombstones with dead men's names. And I might also characterize these as this. Most of them are paraphrased, personal endeavors, and not scholarly works, and not works done by committees. Most of them are paraphrased, personal endeavors. This is what dominates the landscape for the next few hundred years. Most of these, especially the early ones, are not what we might call independent paraphrases, that is, based right on the Greek text. Rather, they take the KJV, particularly portions of the New Testament, and paraphrase it with their own personal explanatory notes. So remember that we're not talking about a whole new ball game here, a whole new translation really. We're talking about a paraphrased revision of the KJV that a man wants to do himself. Generally, it's not the whole Bible. That's rare. It's the New Testament or portions of the New Testament that he paraphrases. He takes the KJV, he paraphrases it, maybe updates some things, and adds in his own explanatory notes. Someone has said that between 1611, the KJV, and 1881, the English Revised Version, 70 pirate versions came forth. Pirate versions in quotation marks, of course. It was legal to do it, but pirate versions, someone taking over the KJV and kind of tampering with it and then almost using it for their own gain or satisfaction. These are not independent paraphrases where someone has gone back to the Greek, they understand the Greek, and then they paraphrase the Greek in English. No, that'd be one thing. That's bad enough, by the way, paraphrasing. That's bad enough. But that would be one thing to go to the Greek. They don't go to the Greek. They go to another English Bible, the KJV, and then paraphrase it. I mean, you're so many steps removed from the original manuscripts, it's ludicrous by now. Now, are we going to discuss these 70 pirate versions? No, I have good news for you. We'll just look at maybe half of them. Around 40 maybe. And I have even better news than that. Probably almost all of them will discuss in one sentence or maybe two. So you said, well, praise God for that. Yes, that'd take us forever to look at this, and what can you say? But it's a rehash of the KJV. And then the next sentence for the next one, it's a rehash of the KJV. Some of them are more important than others. That's certainly true, but I don't want to caricature it too badly, but I don't know if that's possible. We'll look at around half of them, most of them in a sentence or two. Let's start with the 1600s, the same century of the KJV. And anything that's important along the way, any translations that are important, of course I will make note of that for you. And the rest of it's just to fill up your notes, and you can basically forget about it. And you won't even have to try to forget, though, will you? Now, 1600, just a statement or two before I start giving you 1, 2, 3, 4. Remember that the Geneva Bible continues to be printed for almost a half a century, up into the 1640s. The Puritans really liked the notes in it. So that's a Bible that is in the struggle with the KJV for a short period of time. When the KJV first comes out, the Geneva Bible is still very strong. But as just a very short period of time elapses, over the next few years, the KJV takes the ascendancy. As we get into the mid to the late 1600s, then we're having new translations come out, which, as I say, are paraphrases of the KJV. So here we go. Number 1. We only have time to look at a few this morning. Number 1, 1652. Most of these I'll give by date, because a lot of them don't even have a name. This is one of the earliest references that we have, though. 1652, we have a Puritan paraphrase. We don't even know who did it. A Puritan paraphrase of the entire New Testament. Number 2, in 1675. See, we've got 39 to go then. We just did one of them. In 1675, we have a Puritan paraphrase of the Pauline epistles. Sorry about all those P's in that sentence. Paul's writings are paraphrased, 1675. Number 3, and the last one we're going to look at during the 1600s, 1685. We do have a name for this one. New Testament Paraphrase and Notes. New Testament Paraphrase and Notes. This work was done by one of the most famous Puritan writers that ever lived. You may have heard his name before, so you may want to take note of this. It's not an important work for sure, but this man is important, extremely important in Puritan theology. Richard Baxter. You ever heard of him before? Some of you are shaking your head. Yes, Richard Baxter. Don't buy his Bible. I doubt you could find it. Well, of course you couldn't. But he does have another work that's very important. Saints' Everlasting Rest. That's still in print today, by the way. You can find it. CBD carries it, I'm sure. Saints' Everlasting Rest. It's an interesting work. That's probably why Baxter is so well remembered today, for this book that's still in print, Saints' Everlasting Rest. What it deals with, you'll have to buy it and find out yourself. He's probably remembered best for that, but then a lot of lay people have read this book like they read Thomas à Kempis on the Imitation of Christ and things like this. I mean, it's that, or Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. It's that type of book. It's so famous. It's been in existence so long. But then a lot of lay people would do nothing more than, or nothing but, equate Baxter's name with this work here. And he's much more important for theological reasons than this book right here would intimate. He's a very famous Puritan scholar that did a lot of writing. I mean, he's got volumes that are still in print today also of his theological writings. But this is his popular book, Saints' Everlasting Rest, that is so famous today. Any of you ever read that book before? You heard of it before? 1700s. Profusion of new translations comes out during this century. I'm just going to mention 2 this morning, and we'll pick up with number 3 under the 1700s next week then. Number one, and as we go along, we'll start getting more and more important works then. These first Puritan paraphrases are just not important for our purposes at all. This work also had a name. It was entitled Paraphrases. If you notice, every one of these is a paraphrase so far. That's why I warned you with that. For a long period of time, we're going to have nothing but paraphrases. And they don't base anything on Greek or Hebrew. They base it on the KJV. It was done by another very famous Puritan man. I was just reading about him yesterday, not in any connection to this. Samuel Clarke, not as famous as Baxter, but I like to give you these names, and then I'll give them to you again, then I'll give them to you again, and pretty soon you'll remember these when we study something about these men one day. Samuel Clarke, C-L-A-R-K-E. I think I was reading some of his works the other day about proofs for the existence of God, but he also was a Puritan writer. Paraphrases of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's all that he did. Number two, I'm going to go back to number one each time we change century, so we can stay with that century. We're in the 1700s. Number two, oh, the date on that, by the way, was 1701 to 1702. Number two, 1703. The name, paraphrase, and commentary. Notice most of them have notes along with them. Paraphrase and commentary on the New Testament, 2 volumes. It was a full work, in other words. Daniel Whitby was the author. He's another famous man. He was an Anglican scholar, not Puritan now. Clarke and Baxter were Puritans. He was an Anglican scholar who was born in 1638. He died in 1726. Quite a lifespan for that day and age, almost a century. He published 39 books. He was rabidly opposed to RCism, Roman Catholicism, as well as Calvinism. Being an Anglican, that's obvious. His Bible was his most important book, most important of the 39 books, and it continued in use for over a century. It's not an important work, though, so you wouldn't have to remember it, although you might want to remember this man's name, Daniel Whitby. Say, why remember his name? Well, I'll give you something to connect it to. It's a paraphrase as well as notes, 2 volumes of the entire New Testament. I'll tell you why Whitby is so famous. Whitby, in his notes, is the one who pioneered this view. Post-mills sometimes don't like us to know that, because they say, well, we base post-millennialism on the Bible, not on some man's notes. And then they criticize any of us pre-mills because they say, well, you base your beliefs on the notes of Scofield's Reference Bible. So we're all slinging those charges at each other. Well, you base yours on Scofield. You base yours on Daniel Whitby. But the problem with so many pre-mills, everyone knows about Scofield's notes. I mean, everyone knows about that. And everyone criticizes pre-mills for basing it on Scofield's notes. What pre-mills don't know is they could say the same thing about post-mills if they just knew about Daniel Whitby. But, of course, most people don't. So this is what is very significant. This is why the man Whitby would be important in theological history and study, especially in eschatology, is because his notes pioneered the post-mill concept. Whitby erroneously felt that the world would grow better and better. It would convert to Christ. The Jews would return to Palestine. By the way, he was literal enough in his reading that he got that truth. I've always thought that interesting about any post-mills who believe this. That takes a very, very literal reading of Scripture to think the Jews would ever get their holy land and their holy city back. So they're going to read literally for that and then spiritualize everything else. I'll show you what I mean by that here in just a moment. The Jews would return to Palestine. The Turks and the Catholics would be subdued. They're that harlot woman over in Revelation 17 and 18. So the Turks and Catholics would be subdued. 1,000 years of peace would ensue, followed by Christ's second advent, his return to the earth. Hence the name post-mill. The second advent follows the millennium. Post-millennialism. Post means after. Jump over into Revelation chapter 20 with me for a moment, and I'll show you what I said I was going to show you. You probably don't know enough of the intricacies of pre-mill, a-mill, post-mill to really get into this argument, and we don't have time for that in biblical lit. That's for eschatology. But perhaps you do know enough to realize that if you ever believe, let's say you believe prior to 1948, whenever it happened, or prior to 1898, when the Zionist Congress first met in Switzerland, if you ever believe back in those years, such as 1703, when Whitby is writing this, that the Jews would get their land back, they'd return to Palestine, what are you going to base that on? That'd take a very literal reading of the Old and the New Testament, that the kingdom somehow would be restored to Israel. Well, then what are we going to do with this business over in Revelation 20? Well, I hate to even get you to turn, because you've got to take all 15 verses. Because a half a dozen times here, the millennium is spoken of as a very literal period, and according to chapter 19 of Revelation, Jesus has already returned. Chapter 19 is his return, chapter 20 is the millennium. Well, if you're going to take a literal reading of Scripture of Revelation 19 and 20, there's no way you could be post-mill, Christ coming back after the millennium, because that would have to have him coming back in chapter 21 of the book of Revelation instead of 19. 19, he comes back. The millennium is chapter 20. The eternal state is chapters 21 and 22. That spells premillennialism then. So he's inconsistent in his eschatology. He read some portions of Scripture literally, where God would subdue his enemies and Israel would make it back to Palestine, and then he spiritualized other parts by saying that the world would grow better and better, and the whole world would convert under the influence of the gospel of Christ, and 1,000 years more or less of peace would ensue, followed by the return of the Lord to the earth. And that simply is not true. This may be an unfair statement to leave you with about this man, but it is said that he turned Unitarian late in his life. That is unfair, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's unfair if we use that as a proof against pre-mill, because then we try to look and see, what happened to these people? Because we'll say, well, I told you that's what happens when you're post-mill. You end up a Jehovah's Witness or Unitarian or whatever, and it's really not true. That'd be an unfair caricature, because many evangelical Christians, or let's say some today, and the number's on the rise, by the way, hold to post-millennialism. So it's unfair to ask them the typical question, do you still beat your wife? Because as soon as you ask them that, they're guilty. As soon as you say, he turned Unitarian, we say, well, yeah, that's what it did turn him. That post-mill stuff turned him into a Unitarian. Let me just list a few names. This is totally aside from biblical lit, but a few names of other scholars who have held to this millennial position, and I think they have done it on the basis of Whitby's notes. Of course, Whitby convinced them, they get into Scripture and think that they can see it for themselves. People like famous names in theology. I thought you'd want to know who some of the post-mills are. A.H. Strong, Baptist scholar that taught at down in Rochester, New York, at Rochester Theological Seminary in early 1900s. Big, thick, tiny print, systematic theology. Strong was a post-mill. Let's see, I should have given you another man earlier to get it in the right chronological order, thinking as I go along. Charles Hodge was post-mill. He was in the 1800s, taught at Princeton Seminary in New Jersey. Then A.H. Strong, and then Lorraine Bettner, B-O-E-T-T-N-E-R. You pronounce that Bettner. Loraine Bettner, who was a farm boy from Missouri, but he does have theological training, and he's written several theological books, one against Roman Catholicism, one on the millennium, one on the Calvinistic doctrine of predestination, a few others. I can't remember exactly what the rest of them are. And he's not current. This was like 1940s. And then to give you probably the newest scholar, evangelical scholar, who is a post-mill advocate, my advisor in seminary and a friend of mine then, John Jefferson Davis, who has a new book that was published last year by Baker that's entitled, and you can tell from a title oftentimes what millennial position. Before the book was even in print, Jack told me about it, and he said, get a copy of it as soon as it comes out. He wrote me a letter, and he said, get a copy of it as soon as it comes out. It was in print, but it wasn't available yet. And so I kept my eyes open for it, and I since then have gotten a copy and have read it. And I just think it's 100% opposed to what the Scripture obviously teaches about the millennial view. But Jack Davis has revised this. See, people haven't held to this for a long time. I mean, back in the 18th century, or 19th century, that's one thing. Loraine Bettner in this century, that was odd, especially right during the Second World War. It was odd for an evangelical Christian to hold a postmillennialism. And now, after all the problems that we've had in the world, it's doubly odd for someone as well known as Jack Davis to hold to a post-mill view. And whenever we were over at his house one night for conversation and dessert, he was just finishing up on the manuscript of Christ's Victorious Kingdom, and he was really, pushing its sale on those of us who were seminary students visiting him. And we got into this millennial discussion. And I've read some reviews about the book where it seems like he more is, in his other book, Evangelical Doctrines, is more using it as advertisement for this new theory of his, a resurrection of an old theory, but it's a new theory for people to hold today than writing any serious theology.